My name is Michael Chiu. I'm from the University of Toronto. I'm going to be talking about debt representation in UTXO blockchains. This work was done with my collaborator Uroš Kalabić from the Mitsubishi Engineering Research Labs in Cambridge, Massachusetts. By now, we know that blockchain enables the decentralization of trust. For this reason, blockchain has predominantly been applied to finance. We're creating programmable money, but both credits and debts are necessary for a well-functioning, complex society. Some examples of debt that are crucial for complex societies are mortgages, treasuries, corporate bonds, and even Sumerian clay tablets from thousands of years ago. We've shown that we can create programmable money, but can we create programmable debt? Currently, efforts toward this include DeFi and cross-chain swaps. But a more fundamental question is, can debt even be represented natively within blockchain? In the UTXO model, this is not conventional, but in the account model, this is straightforward. The UTXO model is preferable to the account model due to its pseudonymous nature. Can we modify the UTXO model to naturally represent debt and thus retain pseudonymity? Let's first talk about the major differences between the UTXO model and the account model. The UTXO model was invented for Bitcoin and has some interesting features, one of which is that credits are represented as unmatched transaction outputs. It's also stateless in that transactions are considered valid if the value of the outputs is equal to the value of the inputs. UTXOs are also pseudonymous and are parallelizable. In contrast, the account model, invented for Ethereum, is based on the more familiar and traditional concept of account balances. Because of this, debts have a natural representation within the account model. The account model is also easier to code than the UTXO model since accounts are a more familiar mental model. It also has some downsides compared to the UTXO model, though. The primary being that accounts are less private since addresses are associated with complete balances. Another downside is the stateful nature of the account model. Transactions have to ensure that the account has enough balance to pay for it. The tricky part of this is that the programmer has to ensure that no other transaction deducts from the account balance at the same time to prevent it from being rejected due to a lack of balance. So because of the favorable properties of UTXO versus accounts, it's preferable to create a representation of debt for the UTXO model. Transactions in the UTXO model represent the transfer of credit. Transactions have multiple inputs and outputs, which would mean that they can represent the transfer of credit between multiple parties. The transaction output specifies the recipient address and the amount of value for the recipient. The transaction input specifies the pointer to the particular UTXO and the corresponding unlock script, the conditions necessary to spend the amounts. We need a pointer to a particular UTXO since a transaction contains multiple transaction input-output pairs. A crucial property of UTXO is that it must be spent in its entirety, meaning that if a UTXO has a value of 5, the whole amount of 5 must be spent. You can't just spend an amount of 3. What you can do, however, is spend an amount of 3 and send 2 back to yourself, and this is known as a change transaction. Let's talk about how UTXOs enable the representation of credit. Credits are transaction outputs that haven't been matched, and this is where the name UTXO comes from. They're usually stored in an in-memory data structure known as a UTXO pool, and this allows for a system-level view of the spendable credits within the system. So up until now, we've discussed normal transactions in the UTXO model and how they are credit transactions. There's another credit transaction, however, and they're known as coin-based transactions. And they're the mechanism by which miners are rewarded for validating transactions and proposing blocks. Coinbase transactions are the only transactions within the UTXO model that are allowed to have no transaction outputs. The natural question then is, can we use the unmatched transaction output property of UTXOs and the fact that Coinbase transactions have no inputs to represent debt? Fortunately, the answer is yes, by introducing the concept of an unmatched input analogous to unmatched outputs. Then, debts are represented as transaction with unmatched inputs. To accomplish this, we introduce two new transaction types and a new transaction pool to enable debt representation in the UTXO model. We'll need a debt transaction, which takes care of the debt issuance, an outstanding debt transaction, which is for keeping track of debts and the repayments, and also a debt pool, which is similar to a UTXO pool, and it's also to help keep track of debts and facilitate the repayments. And these three components enable the complete representation of debt within a UTXO model. The debt transaction corresponds to the issue of debt. They're like Coinbase transactions with important differences. The transaction hash is repurposed to record the public key of a creditor, enabling the transparency of creditors on the blockchain. The output index is repurposed to indicate that it's a debt transaction, and it makes coding a bit easier. Debt transactions are valid transactions from the viewpoint of the network, so they're broadcast to the network for inclusion into the blockchain. This is an important point since it ensures that the debt issuance is etched into the blockchain. The transaction output is as usual and records the debtor's information and the value of the issued debt. The UTXO model enables both transparency of debts in the system and individual pseudonymity. In such a debt-enabled UTXO system, it is important for obvious reasons that only a subset of participants are allowed to issue debt, which will likely be determined by the network in a network-dependent manner. This can be accomplished in many ways by special addresses, permissioned architectures, smart contracts, and others. And the figure we have here at the bottom shows a conceptual diagram of a debt transaction and the fact that it has no transaction inputs. While issuing debt is straightforward, how about keeping track of outstanding debt? For this, we introduce outstanding debt transactions, which are a mechanism for keeping track of outstanding debts. Outstanding debts are created simultaneously with debt transactions. The transaction output contains the amount and the creditor's address. Outstanding debt transactions are inserted into debt pools, which are like UTXO pools but hold all the unpaid debt in the system. An important property of outstanding debt transactions is that, analogous to UTXOs, the input value must be matched in its entirety for debt to be considered repaid. And at the bottom, we have a figure showing the relationship between debt transactions and outstanding debt transactions. Debt transactions go on the blockchain immediately, whereas outstanding debt transactions go onto the debt pool immediately. How do we keep track of repayments? Well, repayments must have two important properties: reduce an outstanding debt balance and be recorded on the blockchain. When a debt is completely repaid, the outstanding debt transaction is matched with an input UTXO, which then becomes a normal valid transaction. The outstanding debt is then promptly removed from the debt pool, broadcast to the network, and placed in a transaction pool before inclusion into the blockchain, since it's a valid normal transaction. This is the easy case. The more difficult case is that of partial debt repayments. And here, a new outstanding debt transaction is created with the remaining balance, and this is analogous to a change transaction for UTXOs. However, in this case, a normal transaction is also created recording the value of the partial repayment, which is broadcast to the network for inclusion into the blockchain. It's crucial that repayments get recorded onto the blockchain since this protects both the creditor and the debtor. And this is a figure of the payment repayment process that we just talked about where new debts. This is an illustration of the repayment payment process that we just talked about where new debts go into the debt pool and completely repaid debts are taken out. We apply our system to reverse mortgage markets. The mortgage market is a huge source of wealth for developed societies. Reverse mortgages, also known as home equity loans, allow homeowners to unlock the value of their home by selling it for cash and buying it back via a mortgage. This generates a large source of cash, particularly for retirees. But it's also a huge source of market vulnerability, and the most well-known example being the '08 crisis. One of the problems identified was that the amount of leverage banks had in mortgages were largely unknown and difficult to estimate at the time. Since then, regulators have now called for more transparency into mortgage markets, and perhaps there could have been more alarm bells if real-time querying of the system were possible. Well, what if there was a mortgage blockchain? What would the requirements be? How would it work? It would need to preserve the privacy of homeowners, but also allow for system transparency, and it must be trusted. Blockchain would satisfy all these requirements and provide a trusted history for mortgage activity, repayments, which are a source of huge risk for banks, which in turn might be a source of market vulnerability, and the amount of debt taken by a particular creditor. And what would an implementation look like? Well, we'd want to separate the front end and the back end so that the back end can have all the debt-enabled UTXO functionality, and the front end would be something application specific so that if we want to develop other applications, we can just change the front end. In the context of a debt-enabled UTXO blockchain, reverse mortgages can be implemented pretty simply. A reverse mortgage issuance is simply represented by a debt transaction. You can take advantage of the UTXO model to split the issuance across transactions to multiple debtors to protect the mortgagee's privacy. Repayments are simple. You just send amounts to a creditor's repayment address, and the total outstanding mortgage debt can be queried simply from the debt pool. And because our model extends UTXOs, credit functionality is enabled by default. So the prototype we implemented is implemented on top of Tendermint Core, which is a library for state machine replication written in Go to show the ease of incorporating debt representation in UTXO models. Tendermint Core allows us to not worry about consensus, and for this reason it also handles block production. And the functionality we would have to implement is listed here. And this is a system level diagram of our implementation. Again, we have the node, which contains all the backend functionality, which means it contains the debt-enabled UTXO functionality. We have debt pools and UTXO pools, which are implemented as in-memory databases. We use BadgerDB. And of note in the system diagram is Tendermint Engine, and ABCI is the Tendermint Core's API for developing applications on top of their engine. Having discussed the prototype and the application, let's discuss some issues outside the immediate scope of the paper, but relevant to the ideas that we just talked about. How should a network decide who is able to issue debt? Will the network have network administrators that have the sole power to issue debt, Or will some voting mechanism determine who is able to issue debt? And should the ability to issue debt change from time to time? Should there be a limit in the amount of debt issued? How is the repayment of debt enforced? Is it enforced within the system or outside the system through another system like the legal? In our paper, we looked at reverse mortgages, but any financial application using a UTXO blockchain will likely benefit from the ability to represent debt. And a simple example is the bond market. In conclusion, we presented an extension to the UTXO model to represent debt. It exploits the structure of the UTX model, and the main idea is to represent debt using unmatched inputs. This can be accomplished by the introduction of a debt transaction, an outstanding debt transaction, and a debt pool. We implemented a prototype in Tendermint Core with application to reverse mortgages. And some future directions worth exploring is whether this can be extended to a permissionless setting, whether the unmatched input concept has applicability elsewhere, and how can we build on top of this primitive that we have now. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and thanks for your time.